Thank you so much, Julie. I appreciate that. What a warm welcome. So exciting to be here. I can't get over this chat box where everyone's from everywhere. Somebody mentioned Ziegler. So fun to be here. So excited about it. And also rare that I learned something new about Zoom. And I didn't know Zoom had a captions option. So that's kind of cool. Um, but hello, everyone, and welcome. And thank you so much for being here and for being on time. We were just chatting about that. If you just came in the last 2 minutes, you missed our funny discussion about being on time to things. But I super appreciate it because we're about to go through the parsha. And sometimes coming into the parsha midway through, we lose a little bit of that background from the beginning part of the parsha. So it's always good to be on time for these things. As Julie mentioned, we're in Parashat Beshalach, and the source sheet that I'm going to go through is now just in the chat box there. Julie just added the link. If you don't have it yet, you can click that link to get the source sheet. And for those of you that are familiar with Parashat Beshalach at all, there's one big moment that you're probably thinking, okay, this is what Rabbi Feivel is going to talk about, and that is the splitting of the Red Sea. However, that's not actually going to be my focus today, because I think that Parashat Beshalach actually has something a lot deeper to share with us than just the miracle of the sea. Because what I believe Parashat Beshalach is really a case study in faith. And what does faith mean? But we're going to get back to that in a bit. So let me share my screen here. And just to double check, is the screen showing? Fantastic. I'm getting some thumbs up from Julie. Going to try to get as many people in my side screen here as I can get. In Parashat Beshalach, for those of you that remember my shiur on Parashat Akev, you'll remember that one of the first things I always love to do when we talk about Torah is orient where we are in Torah. So we are in chapter 13 is where we start this parsha. And what's happening? It's actually one of the fun times where the first couple words tell us exactly what's happening and where we are in Torah. Vayehi b'shalach paro. When Pharaoh let the people go, right? That's where we are. 10 plagues have come in and wreaked havoc on Egypt. Pharaoh finally lets the Israelites go free. That's it. We're done. Yay. Game over, right? Not quite. And just for fun, let's not ignore some of the extra little tidbits that happen inside of our parsha here. Vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo. And when Moshe leaves, when Moses leaves with everyone, he takes the bones of Joseph. Now, this is not going to be a deep point to my shiur here, but just as a reminder, this actually is fulfilling Joseph's dying wish, if we remember from Genesis chapter 50, verse 25, which is why it's in here. It's not just a random creepy thing that Moses does. But instead, Yosef says, Vayashba Yosef et bnei Yisrael lemor, pakod yifkod Elohim etchem, v'ha'alitem et atzmotai mizeh. So Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, when God has taken notice of you, and that's actually, I don't even love that translation because it says pakod yifkod, when surely God will take notice of you, right? It's actually it's an absolute infinitive. It's telling us this is something that will happen. Pakod yifkod, these words right here, that God will remember you and take you out, and then he requests from his bones to be taken as well. But even this verse from Genesis is a clue as to all of the nuance that's going to take place right here in Parashat Beshalach. Pakod yifkod. God will see you. God will remember you. Let's keep in mind that Joseph has those words for us as we shift forward. So what happens next in our parsha? Well, we could have said that was it. I made the joke a little earlier, right? That could have been it. Pharaoh let us go. We got what we wanted. No more plagues. Egypt can go back to living the life they want to live. It's all done. And yet, what happens next is not one, not two, but three crises of the mind. Three different perspectives, one after the next, people start to freak out. The first is Pharaoh, who's got a crisis of conscience. Pharaoh realizes he's told that we've left. Mazot asinu, he says. What have we done? Kishilachnu et Yisrael me'avdenu. That we released Israel from our slavery. What did we do? And he immediately orders that we go after the Israelites, that they go after the Israelites. Takes 600 of his best chariots and all of the rest of his military. Now that might seem like a little bit of overkill. Like, why does he need the entire military? Surely we're not that, special. But our text actually told us earlier that we left armed. And we also have to remember that our text tells us earlier as well, actually in last week's parsha, that we were 600,000 fighting men strong. So not a small force to come and try to recapture after we believed that we got our freedom. And that in and of itself could have been enough for the Israelites to hold their ground. But slave mentality sets in. And in fact, the Israelites have a crisis of their own faith. Ufaro he kriv. As Pharaoh came near, they saw them and said to Moshe, Hamibli ein kvarim b'mitzrayim, lekachtanu lamut b'midbar. Why did you take us out of Egypt in order to die in the desert? Now, this is a people, let's remember, who just witnessed the 10 plagues of Egypt. How much more encouragement do they need? And yet, immediately upon seeing a threat in the distance, they spell their own doom. And that's not it. Because when they go to Moses, he too has a crisis of leadership. Moshe too. Adonai yilachem lachem v'atem tacharishun. First, he shouts out to the people, don't worry, Adonai will battle for you. Not, hey guys, we're going to battle for ourselves. Not, hey guys, Adonai has been with us every step of the way. Let's have a little bit of faith. Let's step forward and do this. And in fact, God rebukes Moshe. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe. Ma titzak elai. What are you shouting to me for? Daber el b'nei Yisrael vayisa'u. Tell the people of Israel to move. Go. Just keep doing what you're doing. Moshe is a leader who has led these people through 10 plagues, overcome his issues speaking to Pharaoh, had the support of his brother Aharon, of Aaron, gave the people a sense of security and comfort, kept these people safe during all of the trials and tribulations through Egypt, and yet here still he needs to call to God. What's causing everyone to panic? It's easy to look at this text and say, well, this is just normal human interaction, right? There's a big scary enemy, so you freak out. There's a big people you got to lead. It's a lot of responsibility, so you freak out. You are scared of your way of life, so you freak out. That's the Egyptians, right? And yet, I love somebody wrote here in the chat, change, right? Something's different. I love that response, right? There's something going on. There's a big moment we're in the sense of, and yet no one, not Egypt, not the Israelites, not Moshe, is ready for it mentally. And we should also remember when the Israelites left Egypt, they were actually like hurried out by the people of Egypt, not Pharaoh, but by the people. The people were happy. They were like, get out of here. We're ready for you to go, right? So Pharaoh could have even said, like, listen, my people are happy. They're gone. We don't have to worry about this anymore. Let's call it a win, right? He could have taken that credit of, look, I saved us from the plagues. I got rid of the Israelites. Right? But he doesn't. So what happens next? This is the part that everyone knows, or at least those of you that are familiar with the Parsha have been waiting for this particular moment, which is the parting of the sea. So God sends a pillar of fire behind the Israelites, holds off the Egyptians for a while. Moses walks forward, raises up his rod. They go into the sea. They cross on dry land. The Egyptians try to follow. It comes in. and it kills all of the Egyptians, and they're saved. But the very next verse, that's the one that I want us to really focus on today. So if you've not been paying attention up to this point, this is the moment to tune in. Look up at the screen for just a moment. Vayar Yisrael et hayad hagdola. The people of Israel saw the great hand of God. Asher asa Adonai b'Mitzrayim, and all that God did in Egypt. Vayir'u ha'am et Adonai, and they feared, were in awe of God. Not after seeing 10 plagues, but after being freed and seeing the miracle of the sea. Vayir'u ha'am et Adonai, and here's the big word, Vaya'aminu b'Adonai u'v'Moshe avdo, and they had faith in God and in God's servant Moses. Faith. That's the word that's being used here, Vaya'aminu. And it's not a word that's used so lightly in Torah. It's actually only a handful of places, a few where the Torah says somebody lo ya'aminu, that they didn't have faith. But here, Vaya'aminu b'Adonai u'v'Moshe avdo. Right off the bat, we have to ask the question, why now? Why was it not the wrath of God in Egypt that caused them to have faith in God? Why was it not being released from Egypt that had them cause faith in God? Why only now, when their freedom is actually assured, does their faith come in? And what happens next is the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, Az Yashir Moshe. Moses and the Israelites sang. There's a big long song. Miriam, the prophetess, it's the first time Miriam is called a prophetess here. Aaron's sister, she takes a timbrel, they all dance, it's a big thing. Anyone who goes to services on a somewhat regular basis will remember Az Yashir. We sing it every morning. There's a bunch of fun melodies for it. We stand for it to acknowledge that we were there being released as we crossed the sea. It's a super exciting prayer. I've always actually secretly wanted everyone to just start marching around the room while we sing it. I've never seen it happen, but like, I don't know, talk to your rabbis. Maybe like we can get everyone up and like moving for Az Yashir. We're marching, we made it, we're free. But that's the Song of the Sea. Jen wrote in the chat here, I'll believe it when I see it, right? That's that notion, right? Until it's all said and done, there's no faith. Right? So this notion of faith is something that we're going to address here in just a second. But before we do that, I just want to also acknowledge, especially in a time where many of us don't get a chance to go to synagogue in person, that the Torah itself, the scroll of the Torah itself, is an absolutely magnificent and beautiful thing. Julie knows this all too well as a Soferet herself, that the Torah scroll itself during Shirat Hayam looks like this. Unlike the rest of the Torah, which is mostly in just big columns, there's this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful artistry that goes into the Torah scroll, symbolizing, if you can kind of see, there's a column in the middle representing the people who are walking through the walls of the sea, which are split here on the right and the left. Absolutely stunning. And so if you ever get a chance to actually look at a Torah scroll, have a rabbi or a scribe or a scholar really walk you through the scroll itself. There's some really beautiful moments in there. And I just really want to acknowledge amongst all of this, the absolute stunningness of the scroll itself and the tradition we've been given. But I want to go back to this concept of Vaya'aminu. Because as soon as the Torah says the people have faith, they sing a song not of God's general glory and faith and their faith, but rather they sing a song of military might. Az Yashir Moshe, Shirat Hayam, if we were to go through it, is basically an entire song recounting the splitting of the Red Sea and how God threw their enemies into the waters and drowned them and secured for them a military victory. I'm sorry, I'm just reading a couple things in the chat here. Okay. So what's going on here? All right, sorry, one other comment, a couple other comments here. Number one, yes, there's a comment here about the word faith in Christianity versus faith, the usage of faith in Christianity versus Judaism. We're going to talk a little bit about what that word means in just a second here. I've actually intentionally not yet defined it. We're going to see if we can define that one together. What is faith and what does that mean from a Jewish context? I'm not really going to talk about Christianity, but I'm going to talk about the Jewish context. And the second piece is this notion of faith is also a point where when Moshe is first asked by God to go to Egypt and save the people, the first thing Moshe says is, they're not going to believe me. We see the Jewish people, we see the Israelites at such a low point in our history that the idea that someone could even come in and offer salvation is going to be something that's hard to swallow. And then when Moshe starts showing the miracles and Pharaoh gets harder on the Israelites, who do the Israelites blame? But Moshe said, what did you do to us? Here again, we just saw it not one slide before. When they see the Egyptians pursuing, they say, Moshe, what did you do to us? Right? So it's not surprising that it would be hard to grasp the power of God, for sure. And yet, 10 plagues in, freedom from Egypt in, it's still not enough. It's literally not until they've crossed the sea and can taste their freedom that faith comes in. But what exactly is that faith? Because I gotta ask, did they actually have faith in God and Moses, as the Torah says they did? Because not 3 days later, they begin. Sorry, before we go there, I had a side note here that I wanted to mention, which is that Az Yashir is a song of of military might. But lest we walk away thinking that God is a vengeful, angry God who revels in the death of his enemies, we have this really beautiful aside from our sages in the Talmud in Masechet Megillah 10b, which teaches, the Amar Rabbi Yochanan teaches, the ministering angels at the time of Exodus, at the time when they were crossing the Red Sea, wanted to sing along with the Israelites, wanted to rejoice in the freedom of the Israelites, but God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, rebukes the angels and says, Ma'aseh yadai tovim bayam, v'atem omrim shira? The work of my hands, my people, are drowning at the sea, my creations. And you wish to sing in this moment? God does not revel in the death of our enemies. God would much prefer that no one is the enemy of anyone. God permits us to rejoice in our own freedom, but not at the death of our enemies. But not 3 days later, back to this notion of faith, Vayavo'u Marata, they come to a place called Marah, Vayalinu ha'am el Moshe, and the people start to complain. 3 days after this big declaration of faith, 3 days after they get a chance to gain their freedom, they start to complain. And they cry out to Moshe that the water is undrinkable. It's bitter. And so Moshe cries out to God. And here's the interesting thing. Here's what I want us to take note of. Vayitzak el Adonai, vayorehu Adonai eitz. They call out to, Moshe calls out to God, and God shows Moshe a tree, a stick, a piece of wood. Vayashlech el ha'am, vayim teku hamayim. And he puts the stick in the water, and it becomes sweet. Sham samlo chok umishpat v'sham nisahu. And then God puts the people to a test. But let's look at the order of this. The people complain, Moshe talks to God, and God has no rebuke here. God doesn't mind the request for water. But what comes next after God sees the complaint is that God gives them a test. Someone wrote, the people seem unable to distinguish between Moses and God. They seem to have lost faith in Moses, not God, right? Where are these lines between Moshe and God, the voice of God versus God, God's self? Definitely going to play into this a little bit here. And I love that you guys brought up that distinction. So what's the test? Vayomer el im shamoa tishma lekol Adonai Elohecha. If you listen to Adonai your God, v'hayashar be'einav ta'aseh, and do the things that are right in God's eyes, v'hazanta lemitzvotav, and listen to God's commandments, v'shamarta kol chukav, and guard all of God's laws, kol hamachala asher samti b'mitzrayim lo asim alecha. All of the disease and bad things that happen in Egypt, I won't bring upon you. I will protect you from those. Ki ani Adonai rofecha, because I am God who is your healer. So what's the test? It's the first time that God says to the entire people, as a people, if you want my continued support, you will listen to what I have to say. You're going to act the way that I want you to act. You're going to listen when I speak. You're going to do my laws. Okay, all is well and good. They had a little complaint. They got their rule. We're good to go. And not 2 months and 12 days later, they have another complaint. Vayilonu kol adat b'nei Yisrael al Moshe. And the people again start complaining. And yes, 100%, there was a comment in the chat here, God is moving them towards a national identity, 100%. But they complain again, this time not for water, but for food. And they said, again, if only we had died in Egypt by the hand of the Egyptians, that would have been so much better than dying here in the wilderness of hunger, of starving to death. And again, no rebuke from God. I want us to notice this. No rebuke from God here. Moshe starts to get a little bit upset, right? But no rebuke from God. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, hinani mamtir lachem lechem. Okay, Moshe, listen, they're hungry. I'm going to give them bread from the sky. Vayatza ha'am velaktu devar yom biyomo. And each person will be able to get whatever they need for that day. But Lema'an anasenu hayelech betorati imlo. But I'm going to test the people now to see if they'll actually listen to my instructions. Will they do the thing that I just said they need to start doing? There's a comment here. What is the difference? I'm sorry if I missed it earlier. What is the difference between the effects of the 10 plagues on the Egyptians and the rebuke about the Song of the Sea? Can you explain your question a little bit more here? Not provided 10 plagues and how they solved the Egyptians, which he did not retract. I'm not sure I'm following that question fully. If you wouldn't mind just spelling it out a little bit for me.
Rabbi Feivel, if you want, we can unmute people for questions, or you can save questions for the end. Up to you.
You know what? Let's save them to the end. I mean, you can keep writing them in the chat, but we'll if I miss your question, please know I can only see so much of the chat at once, and so I'm trying to multitask here, and I'm not ignoring you on purpose. But if I did miss your question, I'm going to try to leave a few minutes at the end for people to ask them out loud, and I'll see if I can go through those. But there is a question here that I think I can answer, which is, what are the specific laws that God is referencing here when God says to see whether or not they're going to follow my laws? Right? I'm going to test them and see whether or not they're following my instruction. It's a really good question because God hasn't actually given any instructions yet. And that's really, really important to note. So what we're seeing here is actually a future tense. Leman anasenu. I'm about to test the Israelites and see whether or not they can listen. So Moshe says, so God says to Moses, listen, bread's going to come. I'm going to answer the, all right. God says, listen, I'm going to answer the cries, the pleas of the people. I'm going to give them bread to deal with their hunger, but I'm going to do it in a way that tests them. And we're going to see on the next slide exactly what this test is. Okay, so I mentioned that God rebuked the people for singing and praising the song, who are his people as well, but God performed the plagues which afflicted the Egyptians and made no rebuke about them. So God, in that midrash, in the Gemara that I was mentioning, God was not actually rebuking the Israelites. God was rebuking the angels in that particular midrash. And the rebuke was not that the people had to be taken care of. The rebuke was not that the Egyptians had to be killed in order to save the Israelites. The rebuke was on the rejoicing of the downfall of the Egyptians. So it's not what happened to the Egyptians, it's how they're responding to what happened to the Egyptians. So God says, listen, the idea here is that God is torn up about the 10 plagues, that was the only way to get the people, Israel, out of Egypt was through these plagues. That part, it tears up God. It's the rejoicing of that God rebukes when the angels say, oh, we want to sing along with the Israelites. Now, why doesn't God rebuke the Israelites? Well, the Israelites aren't really celebrating the death of the Egyptians. What they're celebrating is their own freedom. And that is acceptable. We can celebrate the good things that come to us without celebrating the bad things that had to come to someone else to make that happen. And it's a fine line that I think we can learn a lot of right in our everyday life, but that's a separate shiur for another time. Okay, so what is the command that they're given? Well, Moshe sets down the instructions for how they're going to deal with the manna. And what these rules are is that everyone is supposed to get their share of the manna. Go out, collect whatever bread you need for one day, and that's all you take, because you're not supposed to leave any over for the morning. God's going to provide. It's a concept of acknowledging that God's giving you what you need. Go take what you need. There's plenty for everyone. Don't hoard it. And what happens? Vayomer Moshe alehem ish al yoter mimenu ad boker. They say to Moshe says to them, don't leave any of it over till morning. Very much like hoarding food. Velo shamu el Moshe, and they didn't listen to Moses. Vayotiru anashim mimenu, and they collected extra, and they ad boker, and they left it over till morning. Vayarum tolaim vayivash vayiktof aliyam Moshe, and it rotted. It all rotted. Correct. The comment about the angels being rebuked, that's not Torah. That's Midrash. That's from the Gemara, just to clarify that. But this is Torah. They paid no attention to Moshe. Some of them left it till morning, and all of the leftovers rotted. And Moshe becomes angry with them. But again, Moshe becomes angry with them. There's still no anger yet from God. And so Moshe instructs that not only should they only get enough for each day, but that on Friday they can get a double portion that won't rot, because God's not going to bring you any on Shabbat. God is resting, you're resting, none on Shabbat. Do not go on Shabbat to look for more. That's it. Take double on Friday. Vayahi bayom hashvi'i yatzu min ha'am li'lchot velo matza'u. And the people still didn't listen. And they went out on Saturday looking for bread and found nothing. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe. And now God comes in. Ad ana me'antem lishmor mitzvotai v'toratai. How long will they refuse to listen to what I'm saying? That's where God gets upset. And there's a big distinction here between believing that God will take care of them and actually listening to the instructions they've been given. But that's only number two. There's yet another instance in our Torah shortly thereafter where again, Vayarev ha'am im Moshe, the people fight with Moshe. Vayomru tenu lanu mayim v'nishteh, give us water, we're thirsty. Hello, didn't we already go over this? Didn't we already get you water? Didn't we already get you food? Are we not doing what you expecting us to do? Why are you fighting with me? Moshe says. And why are you testing God? Ve'et banai miknai batsama. Why are they testing? Why are they testing God? And the people still get angry and they fight with Moshe. And they're still thirsting for water. And so Moshe goes to God and says, "Listen, they're still fighting with me. Like they're gonna kill me. I'm nervous. Like what's going on here?" And God instructs Moshe to strike a rock. This was actually the one where God actually instructs Moshe to strike a rock. This is not the famous "don't strike the rockness" that comes later in Torah. This one, God actually does say strike the rock, and the water comes, and they all drink. But again, the people bring up the same frustration. Why did you bring us out from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Lama zeh elitanu mimitzrayim lahamit oti ve'et banai ve'et miknai batsama. So somebody wrote here very, very accurately, when someone is unfamiliar with how they are to behave or are starting a new life following a difficult situation, they wouldn't know what they're supposed to do according to an expectation. Maybe God is being unreasonable. Maybe, right? Maybe it's unreasonable for God to test them. And yet, how many times do they need to be shown that God is there before they actually start listening to instructions? Do we find it unreasonable when we give our children instructions over and over and over again and they don't listen and we get upset? Is that unreasonable? Or do we say, no, our upsetness is the thing that's going to teach our children exactly what needs to be done? Our children need to learn what we say is something to listen to. So Jay has written here, is it a question of faith in Moshe, God, or both? And this is where I want it, and this is the heart of the question. Our text, our sages teach us that there are no accidental words in Torah. Vaya'aminu baronai. Our text says they had faith in God. And yet, immediately after, they fail after fail after fail all of God's tests. They stop listening to the instruction, which we could look at and say, clearly, they don't have faith. Or we could change the way we think of what faith is. We oftentimes think of faith in the context of a blind faith. And I'm going to stop my screen share here for just a second. I will bring it back. Don't worry, I've got one more slide. We often think about faith from the context of a blind faith. But nowhere in all of Torah, in all of Jewish tradition, does God demand blind faith. Nowhere. God does not say, I'm going to test their faith. God says, I'm going to test their ability to follow instructions. There is a difference between having faith in the existence of a certain quality and believing that everything's going to magically happen on its own. 3 times the people complain about something that God is going to help them with. Water, food, water again. And 3 times, God helps them without frustration. It is not the question of their hunger and their thirst that God gets upset with. It is only the way in which they argue and quarrel and fight and ignore basic instruction that brings out God's frustration. So what is faith? The Rambam, Maimonides, lays out 13 principles of faith, widely seen as one of the major tenets of what the Rambam teaches are the Rambam's 13 principles of faith. And for the sake of time, because I do want to take a couple questions here at the end, let's just go through these very, very quickly. What does Maimonides define as faith? And by the way, we can hear these 13 principles on Friday nights if your shul sings the song Yigdal, which is a poetic version of these 13 pillars of faith. So feel free to take a look at that in your Siddur next time you're hearing Yigdal and singing along. God exists. God is one. God has no body or form. God is eternal. God is to be worshipped. The words of the prophets are true. Moshe was a great prophet. Torah is divine. Torah is immutable. God knows what we're thinking. God rewards and punishes. At some point, some messianic era will come. God will resurrect the dead. All right, we'll leave those last two for, I'm not going to touch those last two because that's a whole Kabbalistic thing that we're not going to get into. But where in here does Maimonides say God will make your life perfect? Where in this list does Maimonides say that a principle of faith is knowing that God's going to take care of you at all times, no matter what you do, and you don't ever have to question anything? Where is the tenet of faith that says, don't ask questions? It's not here, because that's not what faith means in Judaism. And that's what Beshalach, Parashat Beshalach, that's week's parasha, is coming to teach us. I have faith that my wife loves me, and yet I still want her to clean up her stuff. The people have faith that God will take care of them. It doesn't change the fact that they're thirsty. They still need water. They need to tell God what they need. They just don't need to complain while they're doing it. How exciting is that moment? Those of you that have been parents, I now have not my own children, but a 10-month-old nephew and a 2.5-year-old nephew. And the difference between when one of them wails for something God knows what they need, and that moment where they're finally able to say, "Can I please have?" Oh, what a magical moment. In both, children have faith that their parents will provide for them. They still need to ask for what they need. We live in a world where God is not going to do everything for us. We can still have faith that God loves us despite the bad. We can still have faith that God exists despite things going wrong. Someone wrote, it's hard to let someone else do something for you. Absolutely. So there's a question here. Why do the people need to experience thirst and have reason to quarrel and refidim? How long do they have to live without water before complaining, before having faith? Well, that's just it, right? Thirst is going to come, period. Because we live as humans. Hunger is going to come. But how thirsty do you have to be before you ask for it? How hungry do you have to be before you start assuming no one's going to provide it? If we can step into a world where we say the resources are there, God has given us the tools that we need to be successful, but we need to go look for them, how will that change our relationship with God? God gives us the intelligence to create vaccines and the wisdom to make those vaccines and disseminate those vaccines, but we still have to go make them, disseminate them, and take them. It doesn't mean we're living in a world that God hates us because there's a plague. there's a difference between faith and request. And what Beshalach comes to teach us is that we are all responsible for the way that we engage with the commandments of God. We're all responsible for the way we walk in this world, but we have to also have faith that in the end, God is standing there waiting to be our help and our salvation, if only we learn how to ask. Someone wrote, how will that change our relationship to all struggle? Bezrat Hashem, with the help of God, I hope it does change the way, change our relationship with all struggle. So I'm going to end there. If we've got time, Julie, for 5 minutes, I know we're like right at that time and Julie runs a really tight ship, but if we could take 5 minutes for questions, I'll let people either unmute or write in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer what I can in a few minutes here.
Absolutely. We'll start with Bimaya and then Wendy.
Hey, Rabbi, that was really, really spoke to me what you said about us learning to ask. And my question is, I don't want to say formula because that sounds wrong, but is there a biblical example of how we would go to God and ask for help with our struggles?
So it's a really, really great question, Bimaya, and thank you for asking it, and thank you for telling me that what I said spoke to you. You know, our tradition, when we talk about formulas, that's one of the things that I think our tradition does really, really well. And I want to be very careful in how I answer this and say that, you know, a formula in Judaism for talking to God and for asking for God is not a magic spell. Right? It's not a matter of, oh, as long as I say the right words in the right order, I say my Shema every morning and I'm good to go and God hears me and it all works out well. The formulas that our tradition offers are examples, are what we can use when we feel stuck, when we don't know what to say ourselves. Our tradition comes in and offers us some ways that we can use that instead. And in fact, one of my favorite examples of this is oh my gosh, now I'm blanking on this individual's name. Julie, help me out. Who's the woman who gets accused of being drunk?
Oh, Hannah.
Hannah, thank you. It was Hannah. Thank you. One of my favorite examples of this is in the story of Hannah, who goes into some sort of temple sanctuary area, and she goes to pray to God, and she starts mumbling words very quietly, and she gets reproached by the people who are around her, and they say, "Are you drunk? Get out of here! You can't be drinking." I mean, she says, "I'm not drinking. I'm praying to God." And what the story of Hannah teaches us is that there's no one way that everyone has to act the same way. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all have different relationships with how they talk to God. Moshe has a different relationship with how they talk to God. So I don't want to say, you know, here's a formula and this is the way you're supposed to talk to God. But if you're looking for a starting point, what I would say is look for some of the blessings and the conversations that other people have created in over time, in generations. Look to your ancestors, look to the tradition, look to the sources that give us an example of something we might be able to say. And if you're still really stuck on what that is, anyone is welcome to email me after this class. I'll put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to direct you a little bit more pointedly when we can look at some of those examples together. I think Wendy was next.
Go ahead, Wendy.
Great, thank you, Rabbi. This has been very interesting. I'm wondering about, is it possible that the concept of faith, like that contemporaneously in that period, it's a pantheistic world. And so here the proposition is that this is going to be a monotheistic God that's going to take care of everything. And so I'm wondering whether Hashem is building and training the Israelites into, you know, you don't need a water God, you don't need a food God, you don't need a warrior God, you don't need a personal God. I'm going to do this all for you. And so that this is sort of like a training for a new kind of monotheism that hadn't existed before. So that's why it keeps going on and back and forth.
I really love that, Wendy. Thank you for that insight and for that question. And I think you're actually channeling one of our great sages, Rabbi Ibn Ezra, Abraham Ibn Ezra, who on that particular verse, and by the way, he's one of the few great commentators who actually comments on that verse of, and they had faith in God. And he says pretty much exactly what you're saying. He says, listen, what their faith was in the unity of God. Now, this is not going to be the first time that that unity of God comes up, because that's going to be what distinguishes Abraham from the pantheistic theologies that he's living amongst. Abraham is who we credit to being the first monotheist, of coming and building this relationship. And of course, all of the people of Israel who are in Egypt are descendants from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they would have had that in there. And in fact, when Moshe goes back to the people, one of the ways he convinces the people who he is he talks about that relationship with God. And they say, oh, I'm talking to the God of your ancestors. But to your point, Wendy, and to Ibn Ezra's point, they just spent 400 years being challenged by that notion, right? Living amongst idol worshippers and the Egyptian pantheistic culture. So there is already that, that fightingness, and there's got to sit here and struggle and say, well, is it or isn't it? Is it or isn't it? And only in that moment do they say, okay, now I'm sure it really is the unity of God. And that is one of Rambam's primary principles of faith there as well.